Okay, and a very good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our session with our special guest this afternoon, Mr. Charles Kemp, who is the president of SAPFed. And Mr. Kemp will be talking to us today about polygraph examinations. As I said in the email, we will be recording the session so that students who are unable to attend can listen into the recording afterwards. Charles, very, very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody here today and everybody that will be listening to the session. As mentioned, my name is Charles Allen Kemp. I am the current president of the South African Polygraph Federation. It's a self-regulating professional body that basically ensures that polygraph examinations are conducted ethically and fairly and in accordance to international standards of practice. And today I'm going to be speaking a bit about what is a polygraph examination, how exactly does it work, and what you can use it for. So with regards to the first question, what is a polygraph test? Well, polygraph examinations are used as an investigative or pre-employment screening tool. It is a scientifically validated and standardized test used to determine the probability of a person answering truthfully or not to a set of predetermined questions. Often we refer to polygraph examinations as lie detector tests, but truthfully speaking, that is a term of convenience because there's no such thing as lie detection, which I will be referring to a bit later in the presentation. First, we're going to be talking about how a polygraph test actually works and what are the steps that we take when we conduct a polygraph test. During the polygraph examination, there will be a pre-examination interview. During this phase, it's basically a conversation between the polygraph examiner and the polygraph examinee. We then proceed to the data collection phase, where we collect the data that we use to determine if the person is being truthful or not. We do that during the data analysis phase, where we review all the data that we collected. And then in certain cases, there is a post-test interview as well. But as mentioned, it's only if it is applicable. So the pre-examination interview is a professional or friendly interview that is used to build rapport, to inform the examinee of what to expect during the examination and how the examination works, to gather administrative details from the examinee, mostly identifying information. We have to obtain informed consent. In other words, once the examinee understands exactly what's going to happen to him and the purpose of the examination, they have to agree to undergo the test. We will discuss the events of the examination. In other words, what's the issue on the investigation? We're going to give them an opportunity to present their side and their version of events. We do what we call walk the crime. So we go through the event that happened, that prompted the investigation, and then we prepare the examinee to undergo the test itself. Those are the steps on the forefront. But in the background, there's a couple of things that we're doing additionally. What we are doing is we are habituating the innocent person to the matter under investigation. So basically what that means is we use the pre-examination interview to define to the innocent person what exactly is being tested to avoid false positive results. So when a person comes in for a polygraph examination, there may be external variables that can influence the test. So for example, if we are investigating the theft of a wallet, the pre-examination interview would help the innocent person to understand what wallet we're talking about, where the wallet was, how the incident occurred, so that they can realize that they are not the person that we're looking for, and that will help them to pass the examination. On the other hand, when we walk the crime, we're sensitizing the guilty person. When we talk about the wallet being stolen and where the wallet was stolen, for the guilty person, this forces them to remember the events that occurred, so that when we ask them the questions on the test, it's difficult for them not to relate to those questions, as I will be explaining in a bit more detail a little later. As mentioned, we also define the testing parameters. So during a polygraph examination, you can't ask an open-ended question. You've got to ask very specific questions targeting very specific issues. And the pre-examination interview allows us to target those issues and to define the parameters in which the test must occur. We also gather additional information. So during the pre-examination interview, people get to give their versions of events, and that allows the examiner to gather additional information about the incident, which can then be provided to the investigating team. It helps us to get a bit more information on the where, when, how, what happened, what was being seen, what was not being seen or heard. And all of this information that we collect from each individual is provided to the investigator. They can go through all of this information, and it helps them to paint a picture of the incident that occurred and to put some of the puzzle pieces together. So the pre-examination interview plays an integral role in helping the innocent person to pass the test, but also additionally, it helps the investigating team to gather additional information. Sometimes polygraph examinations are conducted as part of risk management tests. So those are screening examinations. And in those cases, even though there haven't been a very specific incident that we are investigating, we will probably be investigating a type of activity. So for example, if you're working with a security company and the security company wants to ensure that the security officers are not involved in any criminal activity, you can do a polygraph examination for that as well. But during the pre-examination interview, instead of walking a specific incident, we will be defining what exactly we are referring to when we're asking the staff members about criminal activity. And we would even define how they might be able to assist. So as an example, that discussion would go something along the lines of, did you give any persons information to assist them in criminal activity at the site they're supposed to protect? Did they receive any payment or benefit, or did anybody try to coerce them to become involved in criminal activity? And effectively, we define all the ways that a person could be assisting in criminal activity. But we also use this pre-examination interview then to gather information from the security officers in this example, or whoever the staff members may be, to provide us the information needed to see where risk is located, what might be the weak points that the risk management team will need to address, and it allows them the opportunity to proactively look for criminal activity before it occurs. Now, the data collection phase is what most people know as the actual polygraph test. It's a standardized process that we use to collect the examination data. So effectively, at this point, after the discussion is completed, once we've reviewed all the questions and we are certain that they understand the questions that we will be asking them on the test, we hook them up to the polygraph instrument. Now, a polygraph test is a very simple stimulus response paradigm test. And what that means is when we hook them up and we listen to see what's going on inside the body, we provide the test subject, which is the examinee, with a stimulus, which is the question. And then we see how they physiologically respond to that question. So it's very simple, stimulus response. Now, we ask them two types of main questions during a polygraph test. Many people have heard that we first ask a few irrelevant questions to get a baseline, and then we see how the baseline responds. That's actually not true. We do use relevant questions, or irrelevant questions rather, at the start of an examination. But that's just purely to give us an opportunity to fine-tune the components a little bit so that we can see everything clearly on the screen before we proceed. How we actually measure whether a person is being truthful or not is by juxtaposing directed lie control questions or probable lie control questions against relevant questions. So effectively, we ask two main types of questions during the test: a relevant question, which is focusing on the issue under investigation, and a control question, which can either be a directed lie control, which is a question that we ask the person to lie to on purpose, or a probable lie control question. And a probable lie control question is a question that we think the person is probably lying to. Now, to give you an example of how that works, a relevant question would be, did you steal that wallet? Now, for the innocent person, if they did not steal the wallet, there's not a lot for them to respond to, as I will be explaining later when talking about salience. But we also ask in the directed lie control questions, we would ask the person before the test whether they have, for example, done anything unethical or illegal, anything they're ashamed of, anything they should not have done. And once the person confirms that they do remember being involved in unethical or illegal activities, we construct a question around that. That question would go something like, did you ever do something unethical, or did you ever do something illegal? But we would instruct them to purposefully answer no to that question. Because of the additional cognitive load that occurs when they are requested to lie to a question, we get a physiological response, despite the fact that they're not actually lying, because they're simply following an instruction. There's no attempt from their side to deceive us or to mislead us in any way. But nonetheless, we find that we still get a very similar physiological response as we would to a person that is deliberately trying to lie to the test. Probable lie control, on the other hand, those are the control questions where we know that the person is either very likely lying or is deliberately presented to be so vague that the person really can't answer that question 100% truthful. To give you an example of that, that would be something along the lines of, did you ever steal anything? Or have you ever told a lie? By using a probable lie control question, because it's so vague, even if the person is not completely trying to lie or deceive us, even if they can't really remember whether they have ever told a lie, the question is presented in such a manner during the pre-examination interview and the data collection phase that when they answer the question, there's always a bit of doubt in their minds, and that causes a good physiological response. So during the data collection phase, we measure physiological responses that have been correlated to the act of being deceptive on a statistically significant level. That sounds like a mouthful, so let's put it in very simple terms. If it becomes very warm, we know that a normal person, under normal circumstances, they will start to sweat. That is the normal physiological response, and the body is wired to do that. Well, in the same way, we know that a normal person, under normal circumstances, if they tell a lie, it causes a very specific set of physiological responses, and those are the responses that we monitor for during the examination. We also only monitor for timely responses, so we only monitor for the responses that occur during the time that we ask the question and for a brief time period after that. So the data collection phase is the actual polygraph test being conducted, and the technique that is used during the phase is dependent on the purpose of the test. So polygraph examination has different technique types, and if we want to do a screening test or a risk management test, we will use a certain type of polygraph test. If we are conducting an examination for evidentiary purposes or as part of an investigation, there's a different technique that is used for those types of tests, and they vary in terms of sensitivity and accuracy. Now, the data analysis phase, which is the third phase, it's also a standardized process that we use to analyze the examination data. Specifically, we look for data that comes from a blood pressure cuff. You'll notice the blue cuff on the sleeve of the right arm of the subject on the right-hand side. So that's a standard medical blood pressure cuff, same thing used by doctors and nurses and everybody else in the medical profession. We use it for very similar reasons that they do. We use it to monitor for changes in the cardiovascular system. So we monitor for changes in the relative blood pressure and heart rate during the test. The EDA nodes, they're on the top right, placed onto the palm of the examinee. More commonly, you will have copper nodes placed on the fingertips of the examinee. Very often you see them in the movies. They measure the electrodermal skin activity, and this is based on skin resistance and skin conductance. The final one is the pneumograph tubes placed onto the thorax and the lower abdomen, so basically the chest and the stomach. They monitor for upper body muscle movements and respiratory movements, so the breathing patterns of the person that we're testing. A pre-assigned cut score is used to classify the person as being either deceptive or truthful. So we collect the data from the person's body when asking them the questions. This is an example of what that data looks like. This is an actual test that was conducted by myself. You'll notice C3 is the big green control question on the right-hand side. Before you left school, have you ever told a lie to a senior? So very vague. This is a probable lie control question, a very vague control question about his past. Now you'll notice the pattern of green, red, green, red. That's a control question, a relevant question, a control question, and a relevant question. And effectively, what we're looking for is we want to see where the physiological responses are loaded. It's very important to understand. We don't look to see if a person responds to a polygraph test. Everyone will respond to a polygraph test. What we're looking to see is where the physiological responses are loaded to the most, because according to the scientific research, if the responses are loaded on the red questions, we know that the person is cognitively fixating on the red questions, and therefore he's got more salience with those questions. If he fixates on the green questions, then we know he's probably being truthful because he's fixating on the questions not part of the relevant issue being investigated. So just to briefly go through what you're seeing here, the two blue lines on the top, those are the two pneumograph tubes. They monitor the breathing patterns of the person. So as the person's breathing in and out, the line is moving up and down. The green line in the middle, that's the EDA node. So that's measuring the sweat gland activity. And then the red line at the bottom, that's the person's heartbeat and his blood pressure. So if you want to know if this person is lying or telling the truth, you basically need to look at where the biggest responses are occurring. Now you'll notice there's a very big response on the first green question, but you'll also notice a bit of movement, and that's the black line at the bottom. That's a countermeasure sensor that we use to see if somebody is deliberately trying to manipulate the test using certain movements. Now on comparison 3, we can see that there's a bit of movement and a very high spike and also a very strange breathing pattern. That's probably a countermeasure. If you look at the other questions, which seems to be pretty normal, we can see that the biggest responses is loaded onto the red question. So specifically relevant 4 and relevant 6, you'll see the green line in the middle is taller than the green lines at C5 and C7. That's an indication that his electoral dermal skin activity is activating when we ask the red questions more than they're activating when we ask the green questions. You can also see at R4, there's a very good example of his blood pressure increasing after being asked the question, and there's also a slight increase at R6. So for all intents and purposes, although this is just one small part of one small chart, this is what the data looks like that we score, and it seems to be a deceptive examination. So this is what the scoring looks like. Just for the record, this is the score from a different examination. You'll notice the result at the top left, no significant reactions. That tells me that this was a screening examination because specific incident examinations are deemed deception indicated or no deception indicated. Screening examinations, the results are given as no significant reactions or significant reactions. Truth be told, there's no real difference in the meaning of those words. The only reason there's a difference is because on investigative examinations, they're called single issue tests. So the person can either fail the test or they can pass the test. On screening examinations, we might score 4 different questions independently. So for example, if it's a pre-employment screening, we might ask 4 different questions such as, have you ever been involved in criminal activity? Did you lie on your CV in order to get this job? Have you ever used any illegal drugs? And whatever else the company might like to know before the person starts working there. So if a person, for example, fails one question, it does not mean that they failed the other questions on the test. That being said, it doesn't mean that they passed the other questions on the test. What it does tell us is that the person showed the most significant responses on 1 or 2 or 3 particular questions. And for that reason, the wording is slightly different. But the bottom line is a person either passes or they fail a polygraph examination. There's no in between. So the post-test interview phase is once you have the results of the test, we have to, in certain cases, re-interview the person. And this can be in the form of either a professional interview or an interrogation. And that depends on the circumstances. So for example, in a screening test or pre-employment test, you might have to test the person again. And if you do that, you can only conduct a standard interview. You cannot interrogate a person if you have to test them again, because if you interrogate a person, you are loading them cognitively on the particular subject. think about this for a second. If I need to know who stole my wallet and I spend 1 hour interrogating you, trying to convince you you're guilty and trying to elicit a confession, if I were to hook you up again to the instrument, your mind will be on the wallet because I just spent an hour hammering that picture into your brain. On the other hand, if I want to determine in a successive hurdles approach why the person failed the test, it will be in a calm interview process, and I'll give them an opportunity to explain why they think they failed the test. If they give me a legitimate reason, then I can exclude that reason from the examination, reconduct the examination, and see if I get a different result. If I don't get a different result, I know that the person is not being truthful and is trying to mislead the examiner. If I do get a different result, then I know that the person was being truthful in giving me the admission that they did during the pre-examination interview. So the reason why I say this process only happens in certain circumstances is because in a lot of circumstances, they don't want the examiner to continue with an interrogation. Once the investigating team has the results, they will continue or follow up with an interrogation or an interview or questioning technique, or will first try to continue the investigation to see if they can collect the evidence needed before the evidence is destroyed. So for example, if you tell a person that they failed the test, it could cause them to go back and try to conceal or destroy evidence. We don't want that to happen. So it really depends on the instruction that we receive from the client or from the investigating team. This process is also often used to see if we can get additional information or if we can get a confession. Because if we do, that helps a lot, and that's pretty much the end of the investigation in a lot of cases. So what does a polygraph actually measure? Because I mentioned before, the term lie detector is basically a term of convenience, but there's no such thing as a Pinocchio's nose. If a person tells a lie, there's no specific physiological response or any evidence for that matter that is uniquely defined by the act of telling a lie. Lies are amorphous concepts. They cannot be weighed. They cannot be measured. There is no such thing as a physical object of a lie. What we do in a polygraph test is that we infer that a person is lying based on the metadata that we can collect. So to give you a simple example, if a person goes for a pregnancy test, the pregnancy test does not physically see if there's an actual embryo or fetus inside the person. What the pregnancy test does is it looks for a very particular hormone. And if that hormone is present, then we can infer that the person must be pregnant because this hormone is only introduced into the body if the person is pregnant. In the same way, we look for a very specific set of physiological responses. And when we see those responses, we can infer that the person did not answer the test truthfully. Now, it's called a lie detector test because the examination is conducted in the framework of a lie detection test. And to give an example to explain that, if somebody stole a wallet from the office, 5 persons had access to the office, we ask those 5 persons, did they steal the wallet? And 5 of them say no. Well, one of them is probably lying. And that's when you call in the polygraph examination to determine which person is lying. So in most cases, it is used if a person is not being truthful, and we use it to determine who that person is. There's 3 things that we really measure during a polygraph examination, or rather 3 things that can cause a stimulus to evoke a physiological response. And that's novelty, intensity, and salience. So novelty is when a person is surprised or given new information. And I want you to take a second and think about this. If you're hooked up to the polygraph test and I'm measuring the physiological responses that occur inside your body, and I surprise you with the question that you did not know I was going to ask, your body is going to respond to that surprise, irrespective of whether or not you're guilty or whether or not you have any involvement with that question. The second thing is intensity. So again, imagine yourself being hooked up to the machine and then someone blows a very loud horn next to your ear, or a gunshot goes off right behind you. That's going to cause a very loud and obnoxious sound, and this can force a physiological response to occur as well. You can see novelty and intensity walk very much hand in hand. But those two are things that we try to avoid during the test. During the examination, it is very important for us to only collect data relevant to the matter under investigation, and that is salience. And salience means what is the importance or the prominence of an issue to the subject. So a correctly applied polygraph examination is essentially a salience detector, not a lie detector. Deception is inferred from physiological arousals that signal the degree of salience. Fear or other emotions, as well as cognitive load, may follow the internal appraisal of salience and mediate the response intensity, but they are not the initiator of the polygraph reactions. So what is salience? Salience is how closely the issue relates to the person, and we can mostly see that through memory, emotion, cognition, and conditioned responses. So if a person stole the wallet, they will have memory of the event. They will remember how they did it, when they did it, and there will be an emotional connection because they understand that there's consequences for being caught. They might feel guilty. They might be scared of being caught. There's a lot of emotion connected to the interview if they were involved in the matter under investigation. Thirdly is cognition, and cognition occurs when the person needs to think about it. So if a person tries to tell a lie, first they need to remember the truth, and that's an automatic response from the brain. But then they need to give us a different response. This causes a lot of cognitive effort to occur. And then conditioned response is effectively when we walk the crime scene, they remember that they did it. So much like Pavlov's dogs, when he rings the bell and they know that there's food, when we ask the question and we told them that they would respond to the question when being involved, when we ask the question, they're pretty much forced to respond to the question. So this combination of memory, emotion, cognition, and conditioned responding is what causes the person to respond to the question. The innocent person, if we walk the crime with them, will know they had nothing to do with the wallet being stolen. They will have no memory of the wallet being stolen. There will be little emotion involved in the matter under investigation. There will be little cognition because once they realize that they did not steal the wallet, there's not much to think about. They know they're telling the truth and that's the end of it. And there's no conditioned response. So what are the assumptions that we can take away from this? Well, the first thing is that innocent persons have some salience as well. If you are an innocent person and someone walks into the office and tells you that you're being suspected of a criminal event and you need to be tested, you will have some salience, some degree of emotion to the matter on the investigation. Other variables should also be considered. If the person, for example, if we're doing a screening examination and we ask, have you ever been involved in criminal activity? Well, if the person grew up in a family that is related to criminal activity, even if they're not directly involved, that might cause an additional response to occur. And this is why the pre-examination interview is so important, because the part of that interview is to help the innocent persons to understand that they're not the persons being investigated if they're being honest, and to help them to, or help us to identify external variables which could influence the examination. So if a person tells us about his family, it helps him to unload that information and it's not going to cause cognitive loading to occur during the test, and it will help the examiner to change the question if necessary to avoid any of such concerns. So how do we respond to these assumptions? Well, as mentioned before, no interrogation prior to the test. If you interrogate the person and you try to coerce them to give you a confession or an admission, what you're doing is you're loading emotion and memory to the matter on the investigation. It also tells us that we need to use caution when testing victims. So to use a very extreme example, if we need to test a rape victim and the victim tells us that, well, there's concerns that the victim had been truthful about the event that occurred, they will have, number one, a memory of the event. They will also have emotion connected to the event because it was very traumatic. And therefore, your chance to physically get a response from them increases dramatically, even if they are being truthful, because there's memory, there's emotion, and there's cognition. It's not recommended to use a polygraph examination in order to determine if a victim of sexual assault or rape had been truthful. And when dealing with victims going through a trauma, it is important to debrief them first or to give them an opportunity to offload. And we also know to use those results with caution. We should also use caution when testing taboos or evocative subject matter. So if a question, for example, contains a word that can evoke emotion, that could cause the person to respond based on the evocative nature of the term used. Therefore, polygraph examinations tend to be very descriptive and very straightforward, and to avoid colorful language. So we use very simple, simplistic, easy to understand terms with no emotional connection to them. And I'm sure if you take 2 seconds and think about it, you can think of a couple of words that would cause a person to become very angry simply by hearing those words. That's something you want to avoid in the polygraph test. So what can it be used for? As mentioned, we use it for investigations. If the investigating team needs to limit the number of suspects, or if they're looking for a way to focus the investigation to save them a bit of time and a bit of resources, a polygraph examination can come in handy to gather additional information and to pinpoint the main suspects for the matter on their investigation. It's also used for pre-employment screenings. So if a person wishes to work for a particular company, some companies request the applicants to undergo a pre-employment screening test. This allows them to gather more information about their past, involvement in drug use, involvement in criminal activity, their work history. We often find that persons are not being honest on their work history. We can identify that fairly quickly just by the information that they provide before the examination. And then during the examination, we ask them questions relevant to the company that they are applying for. So for example, if it's a security company, we would ask them questions about their past, in terms of their involvement in criminal activity previously, involvement in syndicate groups, and so forth. Finally, a polygraph examination can also be used as part of a bundle of evidence. So the CCMA has very specific rules regarding the use of polygraph examinations. It's important to note there's no regulation specifically regarding it. I'm going to go into a bit more detail about that later. But nonetheless, through the precedent set through the cases, in other words, in case law and common law, certain rules and regulations have been set forth on when you can use a polygraph examination as part of a bundle of evidence for CCMA or arbitration. So firstly, the individual, the person being tested, should be informed that the examinations are voluntary, that only the questions discussed prior to the examination will be used. You can't surprise a person with questions during the test, and that's just a poor idea in general, as we've discussed previously, because then you're testing novelty, not salience. The person, he or she, has a right to have an interpreter if necessary. Should he or she prefer, another person may be present during the examination, provided that the person does not interfere in any way with the proceedings. No abuse will be allowed whatsoever, no discrimination, and no threats. To this end, polygraph examinations must be recorded, audio and video. Should there be any allegations that the examiner is guilty of any of these transgressions, the video footage is there to clear up the matter. According to the CCMA, generally, employers are permitted to use the polygraph to investigate specific incidents where employees had access to the property, which is the subject of the investigation. There's a reasonable suspicion that the employee was involved in the incident. There has been an economic loss or injury to the employer's business, like theft of company or property. The employer is combating dishonesty in a position of trust. The employer is combating serious alcohol, illegal drugs or narcotics abuse, and fraudulent behavior in the company. And the employer is combating deliberate falsification of documents and lies regarding the true identity of the people involved. This is a fairly encompassing list, but really you only need the second number, which is there's a reasonable suspicion that the employee was involved in the incident. And it's on that clause that most polygraph examinations are conducted. So to present the polygraph as part of a bundle of evidence, the examiner must testify as an expert witness. So this entails that the examiner is present during the arbitration or the deliberation session. The examiner must testify to his qualifications, what the technique was that he used, how accurate the technique is, how the process was conducted, what are the questions that was asked, how the person answered those questions, and what the expert finding is of the examiner. All the rules that is essential to expert witness testimony is applicable when a polygraph examiner has to testify. The examiner will also be cross-examined, so the opposition will be given the opportunity to cross-examine the examiner to see if there's any fault they can find, and to ensure that the examination was done so ethically and fairly and in accordance with the rules and regulations. Once the examiner has testified, the judge, commissioner, chairperson, depending on the type of arbitration it is, they will give weight to the testimony. So based on the testimony of the examiner, his qualifications, the questions that was used, he will determine how much weight the examination results should be given as part of the bundle of evidence. So in terms of balance of probability, a polygraph test can either present a lot of weight or will be meaningless, depending on how the examination was conducted and who conducted the examination. Examination should also be procedurally and substantively fair, as is the law in all legal proceedings, and the questions of the examination must focus on the issue of deliberation. Previously, polygraph testing had a lot of problems when we tried to use it as part of a bundle of evidence, mostly because at that time, the science behind the polygraph testing was not great. At this point, it has substantially increased. We have a lot of good science behind the polygraph testing. International standards of practice have improved, and therefore polygraph examinations tend to have more weight. But also in the past, we saw a lot of problems where people tried to put polygraph examinations in as part of a bundle of evidence when it didn't focus on the matter for which the hearing is being held. So as an example, if it was a screening test that was conducted and the examiner asked, "Have you ever stolen anything?" and the person failed the examination, but the hearing is regarding the wallet being stolen, it's going to be pointless, because the only thing the examination proves is that the person might have been involved in some theft, whether it being a paperclip or pencil or $100,000. We don't know. But when we ask very specific questions, did you steal that wallet? And the person fails the examination, that can provide substantive weight to for the chairperson or the judge or the commissioner. So current regulations in South Africa, there's no regulations directly pertaining to the use of polygraph examinations or lie detector tests. This is a huge problem, because essentially it means that any person can pick up the instrument and call themselves a polygraph examiner, or as they often like to do, call themselves forensic psychophysiologists. The fact of the matter is that the majority of examiners in South Africa does not adhere to international standards of practice, does not belong to self-regulating professional bodies, or does not have the correct qualifications. I'm sorry to say that the local schools especially, a lot of them provide 1-week training courses, which is a big problem. The Constitution of the Republic of South Africa does protect the rights of individuals involved, and those rights is applicable to polygraph examinations as well. That includes the right to freedom, the right to bodily integrity, and so forth. Labor Relations Act 66 of 1995 is often used by CCMA and other arbitrary bodies to ensure that the examinations are conducted ethically and fairly. I can point out, though, that there's no actual mention of the word polygraph examination in any of these laws provided, but the basic treatment of the individual is protected. Their rights are protected by these laws, and therefore all examinations must be conducted in adherence to these laws. So what a polygraph examination is not. It is not a form of punishment. It is not a psychological battering ram. It's not a form of torture. It is not an interrogation, and it is not a means to fire someone. This is unfortunately things I have seen in the past. So ensure that a polygraph examination is conducted ethically. It's a friendly process. It's just an interview. It's a professional interview, and it's a professional interview that is used to conduct a scientifically validated test, which gives us a result of whether or not the person answered truthfully to the questions put to them. As soon as you use a polygraph test as a form of punishment, a form of torture, or interrogation, it is no longer useful as a polygraph test. You can throw the results in the dustbin. So what's the function of the investigator or the client? Also, the investigator and the client needs to discuss the matter in full with the authorized person. The polygraph examiner should be fully informed of all details to ensure that they conduct the examination correctly, that they ask the right questions, and that they understand what the examination is to be used for. The investigator will need to decide on the purpose of the examination beforehand. If the examination is to be used as part of a bundle of evidence, so in other words, if the purpose of the examination is evidentiary based, there's certain protocols that need to be followed, and there's certain rules about which examinations you can use. With regards to the American Polygraph Association standards of practice, all evidentiary polygraph examinations must have an accuracy rating of 90% or higher, must be backed up by 2 scientific studies, 1 original and 1 peer-reviewed, a minimum of 2, I should say. Hopefully there should be more, and must not have an inconclusive rating of above 20%. So there's very specific stipulations on what examinations should be used in which circumstances. If the examination is to be used for investigative purposes, so as part of an investigation, it must be an examination with 80% or higher accuracy, 20% or lower inconclusive rating, and again, a minimum of 2 peer-reviewed studies. Screening examinations have less stringent rules as long as the examination is above chance. In other words, as long as the examination can differentiate a person from lying or not, they can be used for screening purposes. But the reason for that is because a screening examination should never be used on its own to make any sort of decision. It should be used as part of a follow-up process. So they should also decide what the polygraph examination needs to determine, to try to define it with the question. If the test purpose is to find out who stole the wallet, the question would be, did this person steal the wallet? Was this person part of the bank robbery? So a polygraph examination cannot be used to complete the entire investigation. It should only be used to determine a very specific question as part of an ongoing investigation. Decide on the relevant questions beforehand to determine if it will succeed in doing what it's supposed to do. If you want to do the examination as part of an investigation, you need to understand that you can't just simply do an overall test. You need to ask a very specific question which will help the investigating team to come to the correct conclusion or to help guide their path to ensure that the examination is relevant to the matter under investigation. Schedule the examination and decide whether or not to inform the person of the polygraph examination. So once the polygraph examination is scheduled, you can choose whether or not to tell the person that they have to undergo a test beforehand. There's no legal requirement that you need to inform the person, but it can save you a lot of trouble. Sometimes people want to get legal information or advice before undergoing the examination. And remember, they don't have to volunteer for the test. If they decide not to do the test, you won't be able to force them to do it, and it's going to cost a lot of time and money. However, there are certain circumstances that you don't want to inform the person because you don't want them to destroy evidence, or you are scared that they might run away before the investigation is completed. But for the most part, we do recommend informing persons beforehand that they have to undergo the test. So proactive steps that an investigator can take when using a polygraph test: only select qualified and accredited professionals belonging to a self-regulating professional body. This is to bring somebody assurance that the examiner has the needed qualifications and can be requested to undergo a quality assurance review should it be required. Ensure that the examiner is ready and willing to testify if need be. As mentioned before, a polygraph examination can only be used as part of a bundle of evidence if the person testifies. If they don't testify, it will be of no use. Preparation for any hearing starts with the very first steps taken and continues with every step. If you know that this examination will be used as part of a bundle of evidence, it's very important to follow the correct protocols and procedures from the beginning. And an ethical test is an accurate test. A polygraph test should always be conducted ethically and fairly, with the purpose of determining whether a person is truthful or not. Provide the examiner with all of the information to ensure that they know how to pose the questions and to ensure that they don't walk into a difficult situation where the examinee has more information than they do. You don't want the polygraph examiner to be on the back foot. Listen to the recommendations of the examiner. Sometimes clients think that they know better than the polygraph examiner because they understand the situation and the context better. But I can assure you the polygraph examiner will be much better suited to make recommendations to ensure that the examination is conducted ethically and fairly, and to ensure that the examination actually gets to the answer that the person is posing the question to. Ensure that the examiner uses the most accurate technique as and when possible, and do not try to conduct the investigation with a single polygraph test. Do not interrogate or accuse the examinee prior to the polygraph examination. If and when required, offer the person a proper debriefing or counseling, especially if they've gone through a traumatic event. Ensure that all the required supplemental and supporting documents are submitted with the polygraph examination as part of a bundle of evidence, and communicate with the examiners as early as possible if they will be needed to testify. Just a basic overview of the standards. So all polygraph examinations must adhere to the international standards of practice in order to be fair and accurate. No more than 5 examinations per day. If you do more than 5 examinations per day, quality goes down significantly. This is stipulated not only in the regulations of the American Polygraph Association, but all divisional members, all professional bodies, and ASTM International. All examinations must be audio and video recorded, and these recordings must be kept for a minimum of 1 year. They should only use techniques that are scientifically validated by at least 2 peer-reviewed studies and adhere to the minimum criteria. Must conduct examinations in accordance with the standardized testing procedures, must use fully operational instruments, and if needed, they should undergo a quality assurance review. So as a self-regulating professional body, if a polygraph examiner belongs to the South African Polygraph Federation, we are required to conduct quality assurance reviews on request to ensure that the examination was conducted ethically and fairly and in accordance to these required standards. So that's it from me with this presentation. I will be answering any questions at this time.
Charles, thank you so much. I'm sure that we are all very, very much more informed now about the polygraph, the do's and the don'ts, the advantages and disadvantages. So I'm going to ask everybody from the floor, if you will just raise your hand. If you have a question for our guest speaker, you can raise your hand and then I will acknowledge you, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. If you are not comfortable to ask on the floor, then you are more than welcome to type a question into the chat box as well. So I want to ask anybody with a question. Okay, perhaps our students are a little bit overwhelmed by the sheer information that you gave. So Charles, I'm going to, as a starting point, I'm going to ask a question. So imagine let's say I'm working for a company, and the company has me do a polygraph, which I agree to, but I'm not satisfied with the outcome of the polygraph, and they use that to, let's say, dismiss me. And this person who did the polygraph was not a member of SAPFed. Would SAPFed be willing to look at the results and give their opinion on the veracity of the results in such a case?
Oh, very good question. I'm going to rewind a little bit and say, step 1, if you have to undergo a polygraph examination, do request that the examination is conducted by a person that is either a member of the South African Polygraph Federation or the South African Professional Polygraph Association. Both of these organizations are divisional members of the American Polygraph Association, and both of these organizations, if an examiner is requested to, they have to submit their work as part of a bundle of evidence. In this particular case, though, if the examination has already been conducted, unfortunately, the mandate and the regulations of the organizations are only applicable to those who belong to the organization. We can't force an external examiner to submit that information. However, what you can do is you can look for one of those members, or you can ask one of the directors of the organization to act as an expert witness on your behalf, but they will have to do that in a professional capacity. And as an expert witness, you can request, and if need be, subpoena the examination from the person who conducted the examination for review, and you will then have your own expert witness in your corner to defend you.
Okay. Now that makes sense, and for me that is a very it's a comforting piece of information. Would you pop for us in the chat who are the two bodies that one would prefer that the person who does the polygraph is associated with, please?
So there's the first one, and the second one. So it's the South African Polygraph Federation and the South African Professional Polygraph Association. So these two organizations, they were one. There was two organizations in the past, and they combined to create the Southern African Polygraph Federation. But the South African Professional Polygraph Association is still a remnant of one of the previous organizations. But effectively, they follow the exact same rules, guidelines, and both of them are divisional members, so they have to adhere to the same standards of practice. They only accept examiners that have been qualified by an American Polygraph Association accredited school, and they have to undergo quality assurance review upon request.
Okay, all right. Okay, but to recap now, so it is my right as an employee of a company to say that I will do a polygraph provided the person who does the test is affiliated with one of these two bodies, and that's totally fine.
So generally speaking, the employee or the examinee has the right to refuse the examination. No person can be forced to undergo the test.
Yep.
That being said, one caveat that I have to warn about, there's been case law recently, in fact, one was just a couple of months ago, where an employee can be contractually obligated to undergo an examination. And should they then refuse, if they do not have good reason, the dismissal will be deemed fair. So they can be dismissed based on breach of contract if they refuse to undergo the examination, had that stipulation been in the contract.
Okay.
Now, the judges or the commissioner in this case have found that there needs to be, number one, reasonable grounds to request the examination. They can't just request you willy-nilly. And there needs to be reasonable grounds for the refusal. If there's no reasonable grounds for the refusal, then it's deemed breach of contract. Now, you can say that you are willing to undergo the test. You just want to make sure that the examiner is qualified and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not the commissioner will accept that as a reasonable ground, unfortunately, we don't know yet. The case is not there yet.
Okay. Yeah. Now that will be interesting if that gets unpacked.
Mm.
Okay. Are there any other questions from our participants? I don't see anything else in the chat. Okay, Charles, I don't think there are going to be questions. Once again, your insight and your practical knowledge is so valuable for me and our students, and really thank you so much for your time. We will share the recording with the students afterwards, and yes, thank you for your time, thank you for your insight, and yes, have an awesome day further. And to all the students, thank you very much for joining. Have an awesome day further. Thank you.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Cheers, everyone.